welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tear down some of the most comforting illusions we hold about our modern world. We often walk through life just assuming the safety nets beneath us are made of solid steel, right? We assume that the logistics bringing us our daily needs are unbreakable, and that when things get really tough, someone somewhere has a backup plan ready to go. But when we actually look at the hard data driving our global supply chain, a completely different picture emerges. We're going to dive into the math, the physics, and the economics of how our world actually runs, and why it might literally be running on fumes.
Okay, let's dive into this by starting with the ultimate illusion of modern convenience. Think about your local grocery store for a second. When you walk in, it's a total hive of activity. It's overflowing with fresh produce, milk, bread, you name it. And most of us just naturally assume there's a massive warehouse out back, or maybe just out of town, packed with endless supplies ready to restock those shelves at a moment's notice. So ask yourself, if the heavy-duty diesel trucks just stopped moving today, how long would that store actually last?
The terrifying reality? 72 hours. That's it. In major urban centers, we're talking New York to London to Tokyo, if the trucks stop, the food is completely gone in just 3 days. That is less time than it takes you to recover from a common cold. By day 1, deliveries miss their window. By day 2, you see localized panic buying sweeping the aisles. And by day 3, the shelves are entirely stripped bare. There is no secret warehouse waiting to save the day.
And the concept behind this massive fragility is something called just-in-time logistics. You see, modern cities don't act like storage vaults anymore. They act like funnels. Food and essentials flow in, they're purchased almost immediately, and boom, they disappear. Now, it's an incredibly efficient system for corporate bottom lines, for sure, but it is definitely not a resilient one for society. Your grocery store only survives because trucks show up day after day, without fail. And every single one of those trucks is completely dependent on a constant, uninterrupted supply of fuel. Which brings us to Section 1, a broken safety net. So, what happens when that fuel supply is threatened? We are constantly told not to worry because the government has built this massive safety net specifically for this scenario. Well, let's look at the current state of that net. The U.S. relies on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR, as its ultimate emergency buffer to keep transport networks alive during a crisis. But back in early 2026, responding to skyrocketing prices from a war in Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, officials authorized the release of 172 million barrels. This massive drain dropped the reserve to barely 330 million barrels, literally its absolute lowest level since 1983. Those underground salt caverns that hold this oil, they aren't even half full anymore.
And this brilliantly illustrates the underlying physics problem we now face. Emptying the reserve? Super easy. Refilling it, that's an entirely different beast. Bureaucrats are trying to buy back crude and pump it into the Gulf Coast, but the current refill rate is roughly 10 times slower than the massive drawdown rates we saw just a few years prior. It's exactly like having one person drain a lake with a high-pressure fire hose, while someone else tries to refill it using a tiny plastic bucket. The math simply doesn't work, leaving our ultimate safety net absolutely riddled with holes. Let's move on to Section 2, the Sri Lanka warning.
At this point, it's super tempting to just think, well, a total logistical collapse couldn't happen in our modern, globalized world. But we don't even have to guess what happens when the fuel stops. We just have to look at very recent history. Take Sri Lanka in 2022, which experienced a sudden, violent economic collapse. After defaulting on their $58.7 billion external debt, they couldn't afford vital imports. Literally overnight, fuel shipments just stopped. And watch the dominoes fall here. Without fuel, trucks couldn't move. Without trucks, agricultural yields plummeted and food simply rotted out in the fields. Without fuel for the power plants, the entire country was plunged into rolling blackouts lasting up to 13 hours a day. The distribution network didn't just slow down, guys. It completely disintegrated. And the human cost of this collapse is just staggering. By September of that year, year-on-year food inflation reached an eye-watering 94.9%. Let that sink in. The cost of a basic meal effectively doubled, while wages stayed exactly the same. Over 6 million Sri Lankans were suddenly thrown into food insecurity, forced to skip meals just to survive. The absolutely vital takeaway here is this. A fuel crisis doesn't stay a fuel crisis for long. It immediately becomes a food crisis.
Which leads us to Section 3, the electric vehicle fantasy. Now, a super common response to this vulnerability is that green technology is going to swoop in and save us. We hear it all the time, right? The transition to electric vehicles will completely cut our reliance on petroleum and insulate us from these exact shocks. Well, let's actually look at the data behind that narrative. While you might see headlines about record EV sales, the reality of the road tells a very different story. Based on recent data, electric vehicles still make up a minuscule 5% of the global passenger fleet. The other 95%, completely reliant on petroleum. And yes, more families are using EVs for their morning commutes, which is great, but commuter cars are not what keeps the global economy from starving.
The real bottleneck lies in the heavy-duty sectors. In maritime and aviation, EV adoption is virtually 0%. Consider for a second that 80% of all global trade is moved by ships, and 99% of that fleet relies on petroleum-based fuels like heavy fuel oil. The batteries required to move a massive transoceanic cargo ship simply do not exist yet. There is no electric fleet waiting in the wings to replace the diesel trucks, the freight planes, or the cargo ships that physically move the modern world. If the oil stops, the global economy basically hits a hard delete button. Let's look at Section 4, the energy independence myth.
So you might be wondering, if we can't transition away from oil quickly enough, surely the US, with its record-breaking domestic oil production, is safe, right? We hear the phrase energy independence thrown around a lot, but the physical infrastructure tells a much more complicated story. Because, as it turns out, not all oil is the same. It exists on a spectrum. The multi-billion-dollar U.S. refinery infrastructure was actually built and optimized decades ago to process heavy, sour crude. That's the thick, sticky oil traditionally imported from the Middle East and Latin America. However, America's recent fracking boom mostly produces mountains of light, sweet crude. Trying to run domestic light, sweet crude through facilities designed for heavy sour is exactly like putting unleaded gas into a diesel engine and expecting it to run. It just won't work. As a result, the U.S. has to constantly export its domestic oil while still heavily relying on crude imports just to keep its own pumps running. We aren't independent at all. We are deeply, deeply entangled.
This brings us to Section 5, Big Oil's Exit Strategy. The major oil giants, the companies at the very top of the food chain, they are fully aware of this fragile infrastructure and this inescapable dependency. But they aren't ignoring it. They are actively preparing for the system to break. Analysts at firms like Goldman Sachs and Wood Mackenzie closely track a terrifying metric known as the demand destruction threshold. This sits roughly between $125 and $150 per barrel of oil. When fuel prices hit this specific zone, something fundamental breaks in the supply chain. The literal energy cost to ship a product across an ocean or down a highway becomes greater than the profit margin of the product itself. When it costs more to move the container than the goods inside are actually worth, shipping just stops. Consumers are priced out, sales dry up, and the economic engine physically stalls out. So the crucial point is this. Big energy corporations know the current system is unsustainable and speeding toward that brick wall of demand destruction. If you follow the money, you can plainly see their exit strategy. Step 1, squeeze every final drop of profit from our current, fragile dependence on oil. Step 2, take those massive profits and heavily fund alternative energy infrastructure and carbon capture. And Step 3, reposition themselves to completely monopolize whatever energy grid comes next. Make no mistake, they aren't trying to save the planet out of altruism. They are laying the groundwork to ensure that when this whole system falls apart, they own the replacement.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we have to face today. We've seen just how incredibly thin the margins are. We've seen that major urban centers are just 3 days away from empty shelves, backed by a completely depleted reserve, running on a fuel source we cannot easily replace, and overseen by corporations that are already packing their bags. So if the giants of energy are quietly preparing to abandon this dying system, where should we be looking next? The data suggests the next economic tipping point might not just be about oil, but about the fragile economies teetering on the edge of the supply chain cliff. Economies like Japan. But hey, that is an explainer for another day. Thank you so much for joining me, and stay curious.